She had a dream about the King of Sweden. He gave her things that she was needing. Gave her a home built of gold and steel, a platinum car with diamond-studded wheels. You know, it's rather wonderful, that, Jeeves.
Indeed, His Majesty King Carl Gustaf does seem to have been exceptionally generous to the young lady, sir.
No, that bit about Sweden and Needen. It rhymes, you see.
Very nearly, sir.
Ho-de, ho-de, ho! Ho-de, ho-de, ho! Ah, now.
Hello and Happy New Year, and welcome to this episode 10 of the For All That podcast, the very first of this year, and what we hope is going to be one of many discussions about what's going on in Scottish politics in lead up to the independence referendum. Today we're joined as usual by Michael Greenwell.
Hello.
Hello, Michael. Happy New Year to you. Hope you had a nice Christmas and so on.
Yeah, very nice. But for today's recording, I've been banished to another room because the cat's in heat and she would just dominate the recording. So
there you are. The podcast would not be the podcast without an update on the fertility state of your various forms of animal. Okay, and our second guest, in addition to Michael's on heat cat, is Dominic Hinde, who is a PhD student in Stockholm and who also writes at the Better Nation blog and is a greenie. Thank you, Dominic, for coming on.
Hello, it's nice to be here. I'm not just, I'm in Edinburgh as well. I'm in Stockholm at the minute, but I sort of flip back and forth.
Very civilised.
Yeah, it's not particularly sustainable, but it's the only way I can do it, so I try as best I can.
Is there not a ferry that goes?
Not anymore. It was taken away because the Ryanair started flights and it undercut the whole process, so there's not been a ferry since 2005, I think.
Oh.
You're a bad time. If only you'd embarked on your doctorate sooner.
Yeah, exactly. When I was 18.
Another reason to dislike Ryanair.
Exactly. I think Ryanair is a kind of symbolic violence. I was on their website the other day and they had their thing where you could buy their calendar with all their hot babes on, which is those terms they use. And you could get a low-cost flight to somewhere you didn't want to go and buy the calendar and some scratch cards at the same time, which kind of said a lot to me about sort of 21st century late-stage capitalism.
Welcome to the ring of hell. Yeah,
it's the best alternative at the moment. And when we achieve our green independent utopia, there will be ferries for all.
To all destinations and no hot babes or scratch cards.
Exactly.
Amen to that.
Everyone will be very, very plain.
Well, actually, I suppose we can just sort of move on to the sort of substantive discussion, which does take us, like you, not on a ferry but on an airplane to Scandinavia. And one of the kind of emerging, interesting and slightly curious stories to me about Scottish independence and what an independent Scotland might be like is the kind of Nordic angle about would an independent Scotland, say, become more like Sweden, more like Finland? Would it adopt a sort of model of social democracy inspired by that political tradition? And, you know, Dominic, you have an insight into this that I imagine Michael or I don't have exactly. I often find that the Scandinavian conversation, not from folk like Leslie Riddick, but the more general conversation, which isn't informed by much awareness of what actually goes on in Sweden, say, or in Denmark, is a bit shallow. And we don't often know what we're talking about when we say that we want an independent Scotland to be like Sweden, because we've got no real idea what Sweden's up to. I don't know if that is something which resonates with you, with you having kind of a foot in both countries.
I think definitely. One of the most frustrating things for me is, the classic thing is the arc of prosperity, which Alex Salmond came up with and made these big speeches about how Ireland and Iceland and all these Northern European countries were sort of homogenous in some sense and shared common values and common aims of prosperity. And that is totally false. If you look at the way that the Irish economy functions and the way the Norwegian economy functions, they couldn't be more different. And in addition to that, Scandinavia in itself as a concept, it's something which is sort of defined externally. But when you look at the different countries, you see that, there are things like the Nordic Council. I mean, there's sort of recognised Scandinavianism, I suppose, but Iceland and Finland are very far apart in many ways. I mean, there's not this kind of large family that I think everyone outside thinks it is, and because of the popularity of Scandinavian culture, and it's become this kind of middle class fetish almost, which is something I feel quite strongly about. I mean, there's something now in London each year called the Scandinavia Show, which is where people who live in kind of suburban villages in Surrey can go to Earl's Court Exhibition Centre and go around and buy designer children's clothes and eat cinnamon buns and drink posh coffee and feel like they're somehow living sort of the Scandinavian reality. And if you live, and there are a lot of Scottish people in Scandinavia actually, if you live in any of the Scandinavian countries for a while, you begin to understand that this kind of Scandinavia where everyone has beautiful children and happy families is not actually very true. It is true. There is a high level of equality. You can prove that statistically, but the Scandinavian experience is not all skipping through Danish wheat fields and nice jumpers. It's actually quite difficult sometimes, for various reasons. And the whole political paradigm in Scandinavia is completely different. You have huge multi-party systems. You have a very different story in terms of the construction of the welfare state. And this is not something which can just be ignored when talking about Scotland. I mean, I of all people, am very for a more Nordic-style welfare state in Scotland, or in Britain generally. But to just kind of assume that goes hand in hand with the countries themselves, and also that all we need to do is aspire to have it and it will appear, I think that's actually very false. And I think that when Alex Salmond talks about Scandinavian-style social democracy, what he's actually talking about is a more of a sort of German or Dutch-style European liberal democracy, which still embraces things like affordable education and the welfare state, but not in the way that Scandinavian countries historically do. And Scandinavianism is a good thing, but I think that in Scotland we're talking about something without really knowing what it is.
Do you think that we're saying it's maybe not necessarily well informed, some of this? There's the Scandinavian social democracy, but there could be two other reasons why people point to this. One is that the Norway and Sweden tend to do very well in all the United Nations Human Development Index reports and everything, so they could just be pointing to those countries as, here's a good example, as one. And secondly, for a Scottish independence supporter, there are also examples of states that have separated quite happily and quite successfully without the doom that we're constantly told that's going to happen if Scotland and England were to separate, or if the United Kingdom was to break up.
I think that as a kind of what-if picture, there's no reason why we shouldn't use Scandinavian countries, particularly Denmark and Norway, which are of a similar size. Sweden's significantly bigger than Scotland. It's about double the size in terms of population. And I think one of the challenges for people looking for self-determination for Scotland's democracy is that people are afraid, because Britain, whilst not being perfect, and I know very few British people generally who think that Britain is the best country in the world, there is a lack of other alternatives. And I think this is something that rhetorically the Scottish National Party have seized on, is this idea of our nearest neighbours, bar England and Ireland, is Norway. And we can point to it and we can say, imagine, I mean, the oil as well is an often sort of remark upon cause, supposedly, of all this wealth. If you look at Norway and its kind of economic development, Norway's oil wealth is a significant development, and it's a causal factor in its wealth, but it's not the only factor. And Denmark and Sweden, neither of which have ever had any oil reserves really, are almost as wealthy. And a lot of that Norwegian oil money doesn't get spent. Really, you need to be talking about the structures of society, the kind of democratic reforms and processes which exist. And then you can start to talk about kind of a Scandinavian political model. But it's not just about wealth. It's also about the entire way in which a democracy functions. And sadly, if you look at the way that both the Scottish National Party and Scotland's democracy works generally, the people who are in Scottish politics are not prepared for that kind of step, I don't think. The only people I know who would probably be into that kind of model is the Greens at the moment. And it's a shame, because it's about the government you have, but it's also about the structures of the society you live in. And fundamentally, Scotland doesn't have those structures at the moment. Whether it chooses to develop them is another matter, but I think it's very simplistic just to kind of say that these huge social democratic giants are the answer to all our problems.
Is there one thing which I've wondered about this when you think about it as a kind of form of political advocacy? So say that you're saying to the Scottish people, my prospectus for independence is something like they have in Denmark, some kind of state in democratic terms, in terms of the welfare provision, what have you. Does that actually resonate with people? Because I've been to one one Scandinavian country once when I was much younger. I have some from some friends here, in Oxford, but most people I would doubt would have, terribly many friends, acquaintances, or family who are from these states. So I just wonder if it is a kind of effective and resonant form of advocacy, because I'm just not sure that it says to the Scottish people, something concrete, that we're going to adopt this policy which already makes sense to you. It seems abstract and kind of, well, who knows what they're doing? Beyond, like Michael was saying, a kind of the good, the just, and the beautiful, something better. They come out well in these measures, so let's have a bit of that.
But I think that's why it's almost more effective, because people don't have that much first-hand experience. And, if they have visited, they will have visited wealthy places. If they have friends, the kind of people who travel abroad and have international friends tend to be well-educated, semi-wealthy, middle-class people. So they'll be meeting well-educated, semi-wealthy, middle-class people from these countries as well. A lot of people, journalists who go over there, even people like Leslie, who has put a great amount of personal time and money into this, and is someone I have a lot of time for. If you go on a press junket, you end up being given the best possible treatment because people want you to like their country. And so I think that the picture presented of any country is not particularly genuine. But at the same time, if you're using it as a rhetorical tool, it doesn't matter. I remember that I did an interview for the Swedish radio back in the summer now, and I was interviewed along with a few other people from Scotland who were kind of on the yes side, or on the pro-democratic development, we can call it, side. And one of the people who spoke was Rory from National Collective, who is a guy who is obviously very clued up and stuff. And he said he was very for sort of Scandinavianism in Scotland, but his only experience of it had been a week's holiday once in southern Sweden in the summer. And southern Sweden in the summer is the most beautiful place on earth. It's this kind of green paradise, and you get these huge long days, and it really is fantastic. But I would not base a whole social model on a nice week's holiday I've had somewhere. I've had a lovely week's holiday in Italy before, but I would not for a moment wish Scottish politics to resemble Italian politics. So it goes back to this thing where I think Scandinavianism as a kind of political philosophy is very good, but we really need to make sure that it's happening for the right reasons.
What about the cultural element? People say that there's links in the article by Leslie Riddoch. There's cultural links there as well. Do you think there are? You've got, as Andrew said, you've got one foot in both camps. Do you see major similarities, or do you see more differences than similarities? I know that's a difficult question at the moment, because everything's kind of very much global culture, and you can find the same thing everywhere you go to a certain extent. But I don't know. What do you see?
I think I would not say there are huge similarities, but what I would say is that Scotland is definitely more similar to Scandinavian countries than the rest of Britain is, for historical reasons, and also I think because of its political history. And it is a kind of peripheral nation, historically speaking, which the Scandinavian countries, although they punch far above their weight today. There was the Swedish Empire for a brief period in the 1700s, but
yeah, they invaded Russia.
They did.
Carl Gustavus on his small angry horses.
I'm very impressed. They had aspirations to reach the Ural Mountains at one point, and gave those up.
Didn't someone else try that before?
I think it's a kind of pattern of European domination. But the interesting thing about modern Scandinavia is that it is a post-colonial society. So Norway used to be owned first by Denmark and then by Sweden. Sweden used to own all of Finland and significant parts of the Baltic. Obviously, Denmark controlled Iceland and Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And Greenland still has a relationship to Denmark as to the Faroe Islands. Iceland has been independent since the Second World War. But these are all these post-war welfare states, and in Sweden actually built up in the 30s, so pre-war as well. They are the result of a kind of post-colonial project. And that's what I think is really interesting about Britain today, is that despite the best efforts of the Conservative Party and the kind of people who, are cheerleaders for Trident, Britain is undeniably moving towards a kind of post-colonial phase in its history. And then the things which we're told we need in British and Scottish democracy, which is kind of strong leadership and global impact, we no longer need them. And we can now, start to look inwards and think, well, what would be the best structures for organising society? How do we best help improve people's quality of lives? How do we protect the environment? All these kinds of things, which became burning questions in Scandinavian countries more or less after the end of this kind of period of military domination, once it became quite clear for the Scandinavian countries that sort of, the show was over and that they were just going to have to go on with it, the 20th century for them was about adjusting to this in many ways. And then you see their rebirth from the kind of 1960s onwards